Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 708, and today is November 8th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show related to Trump's re-election, and so we'll be breaking all that down. Be sure to share the show. You can find it at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor. I do a lot of work for the Institute. I write news articles Sunday through Thursday, and then also I put out this show Monday through Friday, a daily news roundup Monday through Friday, and I do my best to get out a Libertarian Institute Daily Debrief, which is an email most days of the week as well. So a lot of content that I put out through the Libertarian Institute, and most of it we talk about right here on Conflicts of Interest. Additionally, you can find the show on the blog at antiwar.com. I post the video version of the show at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you're watching, and if you're on YouTube, you got to hit the notification bell or they won't tell you when I release a new episode. Also, you can find the podcast anywhere you listen to audio podcasts, and I post those about as soon as I get out the video. Additionally, you can follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_, where I am nearing 7,000 followers, so help me break that mark. And also, you can get all the articles I write and all the other news I think is important I post to my Twitter. All right, let's start off with the story I wrote for the Institute on November 7th. Putin, Trump say they are ready for talks. So Russian President Vladimir Putin and President-elect Donald Trump each said they were prepared to engage in talks following Trump's election victory. At the Valdy Forum on Thursday, the Russian leader said, "I take this opportunity to congratulate Trump," adding he was ready to speak with the incoming American president. Trump also stated he was prepared to engage with the Kremlin. He told NBC News, "I think we'll speak." American-Russian diplomacy is crucial to world stability. During Trump's first term, he withdrew from two arms control agreements with Moscow. After that, President Joe Biden waged a proxy war against Russia by flooding Ukraine with billions of dollars in weapons. The policy of expanding NATO while abandoning arms agreements and helping Ukraine conduct missile strikes inside Russia has Washington on the verge of a potentially nuclear war with Moscow. Trump ran for office saying he would end the war in Ukraine on day one without laying out a detailed plan for how he plans to accomplish that. One issue that could prevent a deal is Kiev's potential future membership in the Washington-led North Atlantic Alliance. As a condition for ending the war, the Russian leader restated his demand that Ukraine agree not to join NATO. He said on Thursday, "If there is no neutrality, it is difficult to imagine the existence of any good neighborly relations between Russia and Ukraine. We are determined to create conditions for a long-term settlement in Ukraine so that Ukraine is an independent, sovereign state and not an instrument in the hands of third countries and not used in their interest." So those remarks followed a report in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm not sure if Putin's remarks were directly related to what was printed in the Wall Street Journal, although you would assume that a world leader like Putin would be aware of what the Wall Street Journal reported, so maybe he was. And the Wall Street Journal report that 3 sources within Trump's orbit say he will propose a 2-decade delay regarding Ukraine's pending NATO membership. During that period, the U.S. would continue to, quote, pump Ukraine full of weapons, and I heard some reports say that potential Secretary of Defense Mike Pompeo wants that to be $500 billion worth of weapons, and unlike the policy of the Biden administration, which we've been very critical of on this show, the one maybe good thing you could say about Biden is he's not gone as far as to send Ukraine something like Tomahawk missiles or long-range cruise missiles like the JASSMs, which Pompeo appears to be willing to let Ukraine do. He has suggested that there wouldn't be restrictions on how Ukraine spends that $500 billion on American weapons. So during that, those statements that they're going to pump Ukraine full of weapons and just delay NATO membership are almost certainly both viewed as non-starters for the Kremlin. And so, I think in this story, we get a really good example of Trump, right? And that is the good and the bad. So the good, he says he's willing to talk to Vladimir Putin. If you had Kamala Harris win the election, if, with Joe Biden, you essentially have no talks, no diplomacy whatsoever between the White House and the Kremlin. And that is extremely dangerous. Even at the height of the Cold War, there were talks between the US and the USSR. And we have almost none of that at this point in time, even though there's, very tense situations between the US and Russia. And it doesn't just exist in Ukraine. There's also frequent contacts in Syria between American and Russian fighter jets and things like that, as they both, conduct operations. The Russians are there, of course, invited by the Syrian government. The Americans are there occupying the eastern quarter, third of Syria. And so you hear frequent complaints from Russia about the Americans entering Syrian airspace. You also have potential hostilities in the Middle East involving Russia. Russia has, as the U.S. is specifically under Biden, has pushed the Kremlin and tried to isolate it from the rest of the world. Russia has found plenty of partners among the countries that the U.S. has also tried to isolate. And this includes Iran. This includes again, Syria, but also North Korea, China, Venezuela. And so I think what we're kind of seeing in that the Middle East is becoming not necessarily the same kind of proxy battlefield that Ukraine is, but certainly a tense situation for the U.S. and Russia. It's extremely important for those two sides to be talking, not just to help manage the war in Ukraine and make sure it doesn't turn to nuclear conflict, but to try to, again, keep hostilities when it comes to the Middle East as low as possible and prevent any American-Russian conflict from breaking out there. And so talks are extremely, extremely important. That is why I'm trying to stress here. And if Donald Trump sat down with Vladimir Putin, that is a good thing. It almost has to be a good thing. There are some situations that you could imagine, something like what happened in Hanoi in 2019, where if Trump, brings John Bolton to the meeting and he starts threatening the Russians, then it could get kind of bad. I imagine that Trump has enough sense not to allow that to happen again, although that might be a little bit optimistic on my side. So generally speaking, I think that the talks between the U.S. and Russia will be a good thing no matter what. Now, the problem is, Trump thinks he's a smart guy and a deal maker, and he's got these plans that he really hasn't told the American people about, even though he won re-election. And it doesn't seem like those plans are really any more feasible or workable than anything that the Biden administration has tried over the past 4 years. And so while we've heard that Trump says he wants to end the war on day one, freezing the current battle lines and delaying Ukrainian NATO membership for 20 years are not something that the Kremlin is going to be willing to accept. And so hopefully Trump and Putin have some conversations. Trump gets a real handle on what Putin's conditions are, and then he approaches the negotiating table with something that Putin will be at least, amenable to discussing, and that the two leaders could sit down, work out a way to end the war in Ukraine, de-escalate tensions, in Russia's greater sphere of influence, which includes the Middle East, and also maybe in Eastern Europe as well. One thing I've been stressing is that if Trump is willing to put, some of the massive American military posture that exists in Europe on the table, as, we're willing to remove this. And as an American, I think that would be great. We are spending less money abroad. Our troops are no longer serving as tripwires all over Eastern Europe. That would be a really positive development. From the Russian side, it would also be a positive development not to have U.S. troops on your borders. And so they may be willing to say, give back some Ukrainian territory that they really weren't keen in taking in the first place if the U.S. were willing to renegotiate its force posture in Europe and move back towards something closer to along the lines of we had at the end of the Cold War. So, there's rooms for talks here. What Trump said, or what we've heard from the Trump camp so far, isn't particularly, doesn't make me hopeful in any way. But at the same time, that is even open to talks is at least, a good thing. All right, everybody, next story here. U.S. F-15 fighter jets arrived in Middle East as part of buildup aimed at Iran. So the U.S. said Thursday that an additional 15 fighter jets arrived in the Middle East as a part of a buildup meant as a threat to Iran, as Tehran is vowing to respond to Israel's October 26th airstrikes on Iranian territory. And again, at first I was very skeptical that Iran would respond. I thought they would declare victory and allow this round of tit-for-tat strikes to diminish. It doesn't appear from the at least from the rhetoric that we're hearing from the Iranian government that that's the case, and now we're seeing the U.S. engage in a massive military buildup in the Middle East. So CENTCOM reported that U.S. F-15E Strike Eagles from the 492nd Fighter Squadron arrived in the U.S. Central Command Area of Responsibility, and then we've also recently said THAADs, B-2 bombers, and we're deploying B-52 bombers, and we're also deploying additional U.S. Navy destroyers to the region. I don't think this force posture is likely to deter Iran. It may give the Iranians some more targets to shoot at if a major war breaks out between the U.S. and Iran, but I don't think the Iranians are going to see this and think that they have to recalculate what they're doing. All right, this is another kind of interesting story here that I think has a lot to do with how Biden is trying to play the Middle East. Biden seeks bilateral deal with Saudi during his lame duck session. So before President Joe Biden leaves office in January, he will seek to sign a bilateral security agreement with Saudi Arabia, according to a new report. The deal comes after the Biden administration failed to ink a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So this story is a little bit baffling to me. I really don't understand why Washington would be so concerned about signing a deal with Saudi Arabia unless they're concerned about Saudi Arabia moving closer to Iran. So I write, Barack Ravid of Axios reported on Tuesday that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are discussing a possible security agreement that wouldn't involve a broader deal with Israel. As a candidate, Biden ran on a platform of holding the Gulf Kingdom responsible for the killing of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the Saudi slaughter of Yemen that claimed around 400,000 lives. While the Biden administration announced some restrictions on arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which were later lifted, top U.S. officials sought to expand the Trump-era Abraham Accords to Riyadh. The Abraham Accords are a series of agreements where the U.S. promised arms and other benefits to Muslim nations that normalize their relationship with Israel. So prior to October 7th, Hamas' attack on Israel and Tel Aviv's onslaught in Gaza, Washington was nearing a pact with Tel Aviv and Riyadh that would see Saudi Arabia receive weapons, a mutual defense treaty, and nuclear technology from the U.S., and then agree to establish official ties with Tel Aviv. The Israeli genocide in Gaza has made any deal impossible. Over the past year, the White House has thought to expand the Israel-Saudi normalization pact to include the rebuilding of Gaza. However, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has refused any ceasefire in Gaza, scuttling the chances of any deal with the kingdom. And so, up until October 7th, at least there's a little bit of an understanding on a political sense of why Biden would want to do this deal with Saudi Arabia to bring them into the Abraham Accords and normalize with Israel. Israel will be happy about this. They could say it's coalition building against Iran, and having a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia will be presented politically in the United States. I know this isn't the case, right? This is a nuclear deal. This is an arms deal. This is a defense pact with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, one of the worst human rights abusers on the planet. I understand all that, but it's going to be presented to the American people, right? If it had happened as a peace deal, the grand peace deal of the Middle East, even Trump, the great deal maker, wasn't able to accomplish this, but Joe Biden did. So that made sense to me why they want that. Now, then once October 7th and Israel's waging this genocide in Gaza, it seems clear to any, rational foreign policy observer, and the analysis on this show panned out to be correct, that Israel wasn't going to wrap up the genocide soon enough to get the deal done. But even if they did, there was no way they were going to allow the Saudis to rebuild Gaza in any timely manner. And so over the past year, the White House has continued to float this Israel-Saudi normalization pact with the idea that Saudi Arabia would then pay for the rebuilding of Gaza afterwards. And so while this has been impossible, again, it kind of made sense, as this is something you could say to the American people. See, we're working on a deal. We're working on this big bargain in the Middle East. Yeah, it's really bad right now, but we're going to make it a lot better in the future. So then they'll, now that it's clear that the war is not going to be wrapped up by the end of the Biden administration, there's no deal to be done between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so why would the U.S. now say, okay, we didn't do that, but we'll just go sign a bilateral deal with the kingdom? Worst human rights record, war in Yemen, oppression of women, like all these things are reasons that the U.S. in Biden ran on a policy of treating the Saudi kingdom as a pariah state. And now this is an even bigger embrace that even Trump was willing to make. And again, the only thing I could think of is that the only deal that's been done in the Middle East during Biden's time was the China broker deal to bring Israel or Saudi Arabia and Iran together. And so this actually did result in Saudi Arabia and Iran, according to the Saudis, them conducting bilateral drills in the Gulf of Oman, which maybe that's what the U.S. is worried about and is now in a panic about the kingdom moving too close to Iran and is going to lavish them with a nuclear program, a defense pact, and a bunch of arms just to make sure that that doesn't happen. Absolute insanity. All right, let's just hope it doesn't get done before the end of the Biden administration here, and maybe the Trump administration will actually botch those negotiations. All right, next up here, Israel signs $5.2 billion contract with Boeing to purchase F-15s with U.S. aid. So the Israeli Defense Ministry said Thursday that it signed a $5.2 billion contract with Boeing to purchase 25 F-15 fighter jets using U.S. military aid amid global calls for an arms embargo on Israel over the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. The contract is part of an arms sale that the Biden administration approved for Israel back in August and is worth $18.8 billion. The deal even gives Israel the option for another F-25 F-15 fighter jets and includes upgrades for its existing fleet of F-15s and related equipment. Under the deal, for the first batch of 25 jets, Israel will start taking deliveries of Boeing's new F-15IA in 2031 and is expected to receive 4 to 6 of the aircraft annually. Earlier this year, Israel also signed a $3 billion contract to acquire 25 Lockheed Martin-made F-35 fighter jets, which was also financed by U.S. military aid. Brown University's Cost of War Project said in a report last month that U.S. support for Israel over the past year has cost U.S. taxpayers at least $22.76 billion. That includes $17.9 billion in direct military aid and $4.8 billion in spending on U.S. military operations in support of Israel, including the bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. The new contract for the F-15 jets brings the total U.S. spending on Israel since October 7th to $27.96 billion. The Biden administration continues to provide weapons to Israel despite foreign assistance laws that prohibit aid to countries that purposely block humanitarian assistance. The administration has also received around 500 reports of U.S. weapons being used to kill civilians unnecessarily, but no action has been taken. All right, now a couple stories here on the situation in Gaza. And this is really important. Gallant says there's nothing left for Israeli troops to do in Gaza. So Israeli media reported Thursday that former, just fired Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told family members of Israeli hostages that there's nothing left for Israeli troops to do in Gaza and that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was only keeping them in this strip out of a desire to stay there. Netanyahu fired Gallant on Tuesday, and according to the Times of Israel, Gallant's conversations with the hostage family came just hours before his firing went into effect, and former Foreign Minister Israel Katz was promoted to replace him as defense minister. According to Israel's Channel 12, Gallant told the families that conditions were ripe for a hostage deal with Hamas back in July, and they tried to convince Netanyahu to reach an agreement. He said the head of the Shin Bet, the chief of staff, and I think the head of the Mossad also agreed with me. During negotiations in the summer, Netanyahu began demanding that Israel maintain control over the Gaza-Egypt border, known as the Philadelphia Corridor. At the time, Israeli media reported comments from officials made it clear that Netanyahu inserted the demand as a way to sabotage the chances of a deal. And so Hamas was finally willing to accept the bad deal that was offered in front of them, and Netanyahu added additional conditions to make that deal unworkable. So Gallant said that I had no reason to keep soldiers in Gaza. There's nothing left in Gaza to do. The major achievements have been achieved. I fear that we are staying there just because there is a desire to stay. And what they're doing while they're staying there is a lot of killing. And that's why it's so important that the U.S. force Netanyahu to end this conflict. Israeli forces killed 78 more Palestinians in over 48 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said on Thursday that Israeli forces killed at least 78 Palestinians and injured 214 in the previous 48-hour period as Israeli strikes continued across the Strip. One strike on Thursday targeted a school-turned-shelter in the Shati refugee camp in northern Gaza. At least 12 Palestinians were killed, with another 30 wounded in the attack on an elementary school, which is affiliated with the UN's Palestinian Relief Agency, or UNRWA. So later in the day, Al Jazeera reported that at least 52 Palestinians were killed in Gaza on Thursday, including 42 in the north, where Israeli forces are carrying out an ethnic cleansing campaign. Reuters reported that dozens of Palestinian families were pushed out of a city in northern Gaza that has been one of the main focuses of those operations. Israeli forces have been destroying homes in the city to ensure Palestinians don't return. A displaced Palestinian man told Reuters after they displaced all the people in Jabalia, now they are bombing everywhere, killing the people on the roads and inside their homes to force everyone out. In southern Gaza, the Palestinian news agency Wafa reported 3 children were killed by an Israeli strike in Gaza. The Gaza Health Ministry said the latest violence brought the death toll since October 2023 to 43,469, and the number of wounded to 102,561. The ministry only counts bodies brought to hospitals and morgues, and so this is a huge undercount. And a few months ago, a group of American healthcare workers who volunteered in Gaza estimated the minimum death toll from the Israeli campaign, and this includes people who were starved to death, died from treatable injuries, was 118,000. That number is surely higher now. All right, next up, Israeli drone strikes injure 6 UNIFIL peacekeepers in Lebanon. So earlier this week, Malaysia proposed suspending Israel from the United Nations over its very wars in the Middle East. Israel is currently facing considerable criticism from multiple countries about its continued murderous assaults on Gaza and southern Lebanon. In addition, since the start of its invasion of Lebanon, relations between Israel and UN peacekeepers in Lebanon have also been shaky. Today, an Israeli drone strike injured 6 Malaysian peacekeepers deployed with UNIFIL, which is the UN peacekeeping mission, to southern Lebanon. Though there's not specific evidence that the Malaysians were deliberately targeted over the country's efforts at the UN General Assembly, some will inevitably arrive at that conclusion. The attack targeted a checkpoint outside the city, killed 3 people in a car, and injured the 6 UNIFIL personnel being transported in a bus. 3 Lebanese soldiers manning the checkpoint were also wounded. One of the Malaysian troops was taken to a hospital, with the other suffering light injuries. The international fallout will doubtless be the greatest regarding the UNIFIL casualties. While Israel has repeatedly demanded UNIFIL leave Lebanon, the international community has repeatedly warned Israel against targeting the UNIFIL deployment, which has UN Security Council approval. Israel has carried out multiple military operations against UNIFIL property in Lebanon earlier. This, however, is the first time multiple UNIFIL personnel were injured in a flagrant Israeli attack. UNIFIL issued a statement following the incident, reminding all actors of their obligation to avoid targeting peacekeepers in Lebanon. It also advised that differences should be resolved by negotiation, not military action. That does not seem to be the way Israel is headed, however. Army Chief of Staff has talked of plans to even further escalate the war in Lebanon. In Lebanon, 3,000 people have already been killed. And of course, it's just one of multiple wars Israel is currently engaged in. The Malaysian UNIFIL personnel just arrived in Lebanon yesterday and were in the process of being deployed when the Israeli attack happened. Officials indicated that the deployment will continue to proceed as planned. And while it's kind of depressing that this is the case that a few UN peacekeepers seeming to sustain some mild injuries, it is something that could really start to tip global pressure against Israel, more so than, say, the genocide in Gaza, the invasion of Lebanon, the attacks on Iran, the attacks on Yemen. At least, with more international condemnation and maybe put pressure on Washington to rein in Israel. Next up here, U.S. military says it was involved in 95 anti-ISIS operations that killed 136 in 60 days. Dave DeCamp wrote this up for antiwar.com. I'm just going to go over it briefly. I like to mention these because the U.S. government puts these out as press releases, I think, to justify the continued U.S. occupation of Iraq and Syria. If the American people hear that we're killing terrorists in those countries, then we think that, we're keeping the people safe. We're talking about, for the most part, localized insurgents here, Sunnis in the two countries that may or may not be members of ISIS or other jihadist groups that wouldn't even exist in the first place if the U.S. hadn't backed the Sunni opposition to Bashar al-Assad in Syria in the early 2010s. But because we did that, there are still some terrorists hiding around. The part that I think is real propaganda, though, is that there are other ways that these terrorists could be dealt with, assuming they are terrorists. And of course, that's with the Syrian and Iraqi governments who, if it wasn't for the U.S. occupation of Syria, Bashar al-Assad would have retaken all that territory with the help of his Iranian, Russian, and Hezbollah allies and would have stomped out the jihadist threat that way. In Iraq, the Iraqi government says they can handle the jihadists, and I think the U.S., if they're asking for the U.S. to leave, then the U.S. needs to leave and end that occupation as well. All right, everybody, that's where I'm ending the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll be back with shows next week.